Thanks for coming into the park today. What we try to do here is to highlight the conflict between DeSoto's men and the natives that they encountered. And we're going to do that today by looking at both cultures during that encounter. Now, today when we look at it, we tend to think that this was just a one-sided landslide victory, that the natives had no chance of winning, and there was really no reason for them to even try to resist. When we think about it from our 21st century point of views, we tend to think of it like the action hero dying in battle at the end of the movie because he won't give up or submit. But they didn't really think of it that way. Believe it or not, they thought they had a pretty good chance to win. Both sides were pretty confident that they were the most skilled warriors in the world, and today we're going to look at why. We're going to start with the Europeans. First of all, you have to understand about Europe at the time is that the aristocracy and the wealthy had everything. It was nothing like what you would think of over in Native America. In Native America, you would have a situation where a village would have its own set of elders and generally be autonomous, and it would have its own cacique, or what we would call it today would be a chief. And then that cacique would pay tribute to a larger cacique that owned several villages. But for the most part, you were pretty much not autonomous. In Europe, it was a little bit different. All of the land in Europe was owned by a couple of families, and if you lived on somebody's land, they owned you. They owned you, they owned everything that you made, every child you bore, they owned. So if you had a bad crop one year and you didn't have enough food to feed your family and the nobles, well, sorry about your luck. So because of that exclusive privilege, it really affected who could be considered an elite warrior at the time. For instance, one of the things we like to think about as really sharpening warrior skills is hunting, but at the time, the peasants were really not permitted to hunt. Now, you would be allowed to maybe snare small game like rabbits or squirrels or something like that, but when it comes to large game, even if you were permitted to own a weapon, you still wouldn't be allowed to hunt things. We've all seen Robin Hood, he killed the king's deer off with his head, things like that. But at the time, when the nobles did go hunting, it was usually a mock cavalry charge, something along the lines of there'd be several of them in a pack on their horses, and they would come in with a pack of dogs and just chase everything down like the fox hunt that we all think about when we think of European hunting. So there was that, but at the same time there was another kind of hunting that they did. It was called falconry. Now, falconry is a pretty good example of privilege because these birds cost more than people. You could buy several slaves for the cost of one really skilled raptor. And the way that they would do it is you take your bird and you send him out, and then he catches some game, he brings it back, and then you give him a little bit of meat to feed him, to reward him. Now, the key thing to remember is not to feed him before you take him hunting, because it's his hunger and his instincts that makes his instincts to hunt work. If you give him too much food and he's fed up before he starts hunting, then he's already done. Once he's fed up, he's done. So the second most important thing about this is to make sure that you have him under control. You want to be in control of your bird, so when he's sitting right here on your finger, you want to make sure that you grab his feet and make sure that he's under your thumb, completely under your control. And if you're really a control freak, you can take the cord tied to his other foot and you can have him wrapped around your little finger. So when this kind of society transfers into warfare, it kind of turns into a problem because what they would practice is called formal warfare, where you have a large block of people here and a large block of people here, and they just march at each other until one side's dead. Now, given that you have this kind of privilege, if you're a noble, do you think you're going to put you and your friends at the front of this line or the back of this line? You're probably going to be at the back. So if you're a peasant, you're not going to get much of an opportunity to go through to consistently survive very many battles and become a battle-hardened veteran. It's just not going to happen. Oftentimes, your first combat experience is your only combat experience because you're either lamed or you are dead. Moreover, the other problem with formal warfare is that when you have these two blocks of people coming at each other like that in that crude of a fashion, one way or another, no matter where you're standing in the block, you're going to take a couple of lumps. It's just going to happen. So what becomes the most important part of battle is armor. You have things like this, like chainmail, that basically makes you immune to any form of slicing weapon. Completely takes away that. And you also have, of course, the helmet, so that any kind of blunt damage will come at you. It'll protect you, in some instances, it'll even protect you against an arrow shot. Now, if you couldn't afford armor, if you were a peasant and you couldn't afford to buy your own armor, nobody's going to give it to you. As far as they're concerned, if your life was worth saving with armor, then God would have given you enough money to buy it. So, there you go. But more than that, the other issue that they'd run into is that the nobles are not just wearing armor, they're also on horseback. So you'll have a group of them charging in with their pikes, just going at each individual person sitting on the ground until they're either all dead or they finally get knocked off. Now, if you do fall off of your horse, you're still going to have a distinct advantage because the average peasant has a stick that he found. He didn't want to go to war. He couldn't afford to buy a sword. He was just told to go do it. So he's got his stick, and you as a knight have your sword. Now, I don't think we really have to go into too much detail about why that's a disadvantage for the peasant. I have armor. He has none. I have a sword. He has a stick. So that's pretty self-explanatory. The other key to being considered an elite soldier is rank in the military. And in Europe, the way that you would get promoted is through success in battle as determined by European rules. Which would mean, say, you're in charge of 30-40 men on the left flank and you don't lose, you have 0 casualties, but you hold the line and you even annihilate their right flank. Well, that means the next battle you're probably going to be put in charge of a few more men to see if you can handle it more and more that way. So that's the European way. That's how they would determine who was the baddest, who was the biggest, best alpha male. Now, the Native Americans are a little bit different. First of all, for the Native Americans, this was pretty much their entire culture. Everything that they did and everything that led to them being considered any kind of man came from this bow. From the time you were 8 years old, you got your first bow, and you would keep practicing it over and over again. Whereas in Europe, you were forbidden to hunt. In Native America, you were forced to. Every ounce of protein that you have ever eaten comes from this. So, moving on, the bow also becomes a key aspect of something else that's kind of important to the natives to determine these kind of things, which is sports. To the Native Americans, sports became incredibly important. It was a major part of their life. It was how they determined, one of the ways they determined who was the best at everything. First example of sports that we're going to talk about is a game called Chunky, where everybody, the best archers, would be in a competition against each other. And what they would do is you take a nice big round ball, you roll it down a hill, and then the two archers take turns firing arrows at it, and whoever scores the most difficult shot from the furthest away is the winner. So, it sounds a little bit quaint now, but this was a big deal back then. It was one of the largest tests of skill that they could go through, and it was highly important in that there were several wagers put on it. Like, you would bet massive amounts of goods or trade items on it, so much so that if you were relatively impoverished, like maybe your family had been dishonored or something, and you were relatively impoverished, you could have a son. You could have him train extensively at chunky, and by having a skilled chunky player, you could wager yourself into a relatively wealthy position. Now, the next example of sports that we're going to talk about is pelota. Now, we call it pelota because that's what Father Paiva called it in his 16th century ball game manuscript. It's just Castilian for ball, so it's the ball game. And basically, I've heard it tried to be described as sort of like a kickball game or something like that, but really it's more like tackle hacky sack. The idea is you have a post over here. Let's just pretend this is a post. You have your post over here, and you pick up your ball, it's about that big, and you punt it. You drop kick it, and if you hit it, you get a point. If it lands on top and stays, you get 2 points. The first team to 10 points wins. Sounds pretty simple, except each team has about 30 of the biggest, baddest guys in the village beating the heck out of each other. People die in this game. There are large piles of men, as Paiva put it, naked as the day their mother bore them, on top of each other. People have their windpipes crushed, they're stepped on, their joints are dislocated, bones are broken. It's not for the faint of heart. But you can kind of see how the best ball game players would be considered the toughest guys. Just like today, we consider some of the largest football players to be our tough guys. Now, moving to their battle tactics, the first thing that you have to understand about Native American battle is that they do not have formal warfare. They're going to have individual combat where the two groups are going to run at each other, and basically they'll square off and they'll eye each other, and then they'll pick a target. It's like, you come over here, and then they'll fight each other, and probably not even to the death. Now, in the event of conquest, now if somebody has a village and you want that village, then yes, you're going to go in and kill everybody and then live there. But if it's just a conflict, a political conflict, or maybe a raiding party to get supplies, odds are you're not going to want to kill them because you don't want them to issue a blood debt, meaning if you kill a member of another person's family, their family will never again be looked upon with honor until they have killed a member of your family, whether it's you or not. So it's not exactly something you want to keep going. Now, the next thing that you need to understand about Native American warfare is the next thing you have to understand about Native American warfare is the idea of coup counting. Now, coup counting is really hard for a lot of people to understand the first couple times that they hear about it. It's kind of counterintuitive to us today. It basically means that the bravest guy is the best guy. And it's kind of psychotic bravery. The way it works is, let's say you have these two warriors right here. This warrior right here sits back and he fires 15 shots in 30 seconds, killing 13 enemy warriors. Now that guy, he has done a lot to win the battle. However, this guy right here, as soon as the firing starts, he throws down his bow, he sprints over to the other side, he slaps one of the archers in the face, turns around, and runs back. He hasn't killed anybody, but he's still alive. This guy is the greatest warrior. He has shown that he is willing to put himself in harm's way for the purposes of honor and dignity and battle and all of those things. So it's a little bit more difficult for us to understand today based on the way we like to do things, but odds are this guy who killed 13 warriors is not going to lead the next battle. This guy who killed nobody is. So we have two pretty different ideas right now about what constitutes that alpha male in these two cultures. So if you'll just indulge me for 1 second, we're going to try to do a little enactment of what's going to go on during that first encounter. I want you to go ahead and envision yourself as a villager in one of these Native American tribes. You come out of your little hut, and now you're aware of metal, but you don't work it yet because there's no metal in Florida. So there's just very few precious metals that you can actually work. So it's very rare and extremely valuable good to you. You walk out and you see an enormous group of strangers wearing metal skin, which is so valuable to you that only a god could afford it. And as the sun glistens in your eyes off of this skin, it looks like some of them are actually connected from the waist down to these large, ferocious beasts that you've never seen before, creating an image that today we would think of kind of like a centaur. And they show up and they start demanding gifts of food, shelter, and especially slaves. Except one guy stands up. He's heard enough. He walks out and he says to himself, and he says to the guy, he says to himself, I can't take this anymore. So you're overjoyed because you know this guy. He is the best chunky player that the world has ever known. Last year, he shattered his leg in two and still scored 7 points at the kickball game. 2 winters ago, when you were in a battle with your neighboring tribe, he just walks out into the middle of the field, bears open his chest, and takes on a volley of arrows and walks away unscathed. If there is anybody in the world who can stand up to DeSoto, it's this guy. So he walks up to DeSoto's men, and he looks him right in the eye, and he says, how exactly do you plan to make me submit? And we're about to show you his answer. This guy is going to be watching as one of DeSoto's arquebusiers aims this funny-looking stick at a crowd of his best friends. Now, he's not in any way intimidated. The stick's not even sharp, you know? He's pretty cocky and confident, like alpha males typically are. So again, here's his friends over here. Here's the arquebusier, and he doesn't know what, he can't figure out why she's about to point this stick at his friends, but he's pretty sure that it's funny. Go ahead. What was it you said you needed? That's a little dramatic, but that's basically how the encounter would have went. And with that kind of device, they would be able to convince a lot of them that they were in fact gods. So that's pretty much it. We want to thank you guys for coming to the park today, and enjoy the rest of your stay.